So today's our topic is physiology of micturition. Now what is the meaning of micturition? Micturition means the urine which is collected in the bladder, we void that urine into our external environment. So let's say this is the urinary bladder filled it with this urine and we void this urine to the external environment. The process is which known as micturition. So let's begin. First, I will talk about some functional anatomy of the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder अगर आप देखोगे तो उसके अंदर आपको ये दो स्मूथ मसल्स की ट्यूब देखने को मिलेगी. ये क्या है? ये बेसिकली यूरेटर है. ये क्या है? ये है हमारा यूरेटर. यूरेटर क्या काम करता है कि जो ये किडनी होती है हमारी, तो ये दोनों साइड की किडनी में से जो यूरिन बनता है उसको यूरिनरी ब्लैडर में लेके आता है, उसको बोलते हैं हम यूरेटर. ठीक है, इस तरीके से यूरेटर है जो किडनी से यूरिन लेके आता है यूरिनरी ब्लैडर की तरफ, तो उसको हम बोलते हैं यूरेटर. यूरेटर की अगर आप ओपनिंग देखो तो ये ब्लैडर है, उसको हमने सामने से कट कर दिया है, तो हमें ये है उसकी पोस्टीरियर वॉल है. ठीक है, तो हम पोस्टीरियर वॉल के लोअर साइड में हमें ये एरिया देखने को मिलता है, इसको हम बोलते हैं ट्राइगोन. द एरिया विच सिचुएटेड इन पोस्टीरियर लोअर पार्ट ऑफ द यूरिनरी ब्लैडर विच इज नोन एज ट्राइगोन. और ट्राइगोन इज हैविंग two ureteric opening. So these two are the ureteric opening. So these ureters will go behind the bladder and open at the trigone area and fills the bladder with the urine. Now, so these are the our ureteric opening. Okay, and this red one is trigone. Okay, now our bladder is made up of smooth muscle. So here are the, let's say this is the smooth muscles of the urinary bladder. Now this smooth muscle is known as detrusor muscle. So what is the name of this smooth muscle? The smooth muscle here is known as detrusor muscle. Okay, now each detrusor muscle is connected to other via this gap junction. So these are the gap junctions. Okay, so why I discussed here, so what is the importance of these gap junctions? Okay, now let me label it. These are the gap junctions. Now these gap junctions are the low electrical resistance. These are the low electrical resistance. So whenever we apply any action potential or whenever we apply any stimulus to, let's say, this particular smooth muscle, so the action potential or electrical potential will travel all across the smooth muscle. जब हमने यहाँ पे स्टिमुलेट किया तो ये वाला मसल तो स्टिमुलेट हुआ, लेकिन बाकी के सारे मसल को उसने बहुत ही जल्दी स्टिमुलेट कर दिया. क्यों? बिकॉज ऑफ दिस गैप जंक्शन विच आर लो इलेक्ट्रिकल रेजिस्टेंस. सो benefit of this is whenever any stimulation applied to the bladder, now this whole detrusor muscle, or we can say all the detrusor muscle of the bladder, will contract simultaneously, and result of it will be the whole bladder will be contracting as a single unit. Now this whole bladder will contract as a single unit and it will push the urine outward. So we can say because of this particular gap junctions, the bladder will contract as a single unit. ठीक है, bladder will contract as a single unit, or we can say bladder will contract as a syncytium. Bladder will contract as a syncytium. In this particular arrangement, which are having this gap, low electric resistance gap junction, which allowed the action potential to quickly spread through all muscle, this particular arrangement or this particular smooth muscle is also known as single unit smooth muscles. So our detrusor muscle is an example of single unit smooth muscle. Okay, now at the neck of the bladder, at the neck of the bladder, we have this smooth muscle sphincter. So these are the smooth muscle sphincter which is present at this neck of the bladder. This sphincter is known as internal urethral sphincter. This sphincter is known as internal urethral sphincter because here is our urethra. So it is the urethra which is taking urine outward, and this sphincter is present over the urethra near the bladder. So we can call it internal urethral sphincter. So if it is an internal urethric sphincter, of course we should know that there are some external urethric sphincter also. So at this point, these are the point where we are having our external urethric sphincter. So this is our external urethric sphincter. Let me highlight that this part, these are our pelvic floor muscles. These are our pelvic floor muscles, and this particular urethra, this particular part of the urethra which is present through this pelvic floor muscle, this particular part of the urethra is known as membranous urethra. Okay, and at the membranous urethra, what we are having, the sphincter is known as external urethral sphincter. Okay, so internal urethric sphincter is made up of smooth muscle. So this is made up of smooth muscles, and external urethric sphincter is made up of skeletal muscle. Okay, so if it is made up of skeletal muscles, that means it is under voluntary control. So it means we can voluntarily contract or relax this particular external urethric sphincter. But this internal urethric sphincter is made up of smooth muscle, and that means we cannot voluntarily have any control over it. So we can say it is under control of involuntary control. ठीक है, वॉलेंटरी कंट्रोल क्यों है? क्योंकि इस वाले स्फिंक्टर जो है उसको सोमेटिक नर्व सप्लाई करती है. जो भी स्केलेटल मसल्स है उसको जो नर्व सप्लाई करती है उसको हम बोलते हैं सोमेटिक नर्व. ठीक है, स्मूथ मसल्स है वो इनवॉलेंटरीली है, हमारा उसके ऊपर कोई कंट्रोल नहीं है. क्यों? क्योंकि इस वाले स्मूथ मसल्स को जो नर्वस सिस्टम सप्लाई करता है उसको हम बोलते हैं ऑटोनोमिक नर्वस सिस्टम. ठीक है, वो हमारे कंट्रोल में नहीं है, वो अपने आप ऑटोमेटिकली कंट्रोल होता है. तो ये सप्लाइड बाय इंटरनल यूरेथ्रिक स्फिंक्टर इज सप्लाइड बाय ऑटोनोमिक नर्वस सिस्टम एंड विच इज आर under involuntary control. Now the same autonomic nervous system also supplies the detrusor muscles. ठीक है, so we can say the detrusor muscle and the internal urethric sphincter both are under involuntary control. So these are the detrusor muscles and our internal urethric sphincter both are under involuntary control supplied by autonomic nervous system, whereas the external urethric sphincter is under voluntary control supplied by the somatic nerve. ठीक है, so we have understood what is the detrusor muscle, what are the sphincter present, two sphincters, which one is under voluntary control, which one is under involuntary control. ठीक है, now we will move on to the micturition reflex. Now I'll go to the micturition reflex. ठीक है, now so this is our urinary bladder. ठीक है, so it is our urinary bladder. These are the transverse section of the spinal cord. ठीक है, so these are the transverse section of the spinal cord. This is the urinary bladder. Now as the urine fills in the bladder, so let's say this is the urine which is filled inside the bladder. Now urine filling will cause the stretching of the bladder wall, so this bladder wall will be stretched, and here in the bladder wall we have this stretch receptor present. So these are the stretch receptors. These are what? These are the stretch receptors. What they will do? They will sense the stretch. Whatever the stretching present, they will sense and they will get activated. So let's say, so let's say urine is collected inside the bladder and it will stretch the bladder. Now this stretching will be sensed by our stretch receptor, which will get stimulated, and now from this stretch receptor we have the sensory nerve going to the spinal cord. Okay, let me draw it other way. Yes, so this is the sensory nerve taking signal to the spinal cord, and of course we are having this dorsal root ganglion because it is sensory nerve and which is going to the spinal cord. So what are these? First let me name it. These are the efferent nerve. Whichever the nerve which taking the sensation towards the central nervous system, we call it efferent nerve. Okay, and this efferent nerve is present inside the which nerve? So this is the, let's say this is the nerve. This efferent nerve fiber is present inside this pelvic splanchnic nerve. So this efferent fiber is present in pelvic splanchnic nerve, and which take the sensation to our spinal cord segment. Now this spinal cord segment is of sacral. This is the this is the sacral spinal cord segment, sacral 2, 3 and 4. You all know that. So these are our spinal cord, let's say. So a spinal cord having various level. Let's say we have the cervical, we have the thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and lastly we have this coccygeal. So I am talking about this particular sacral segment, and I have taken the cross section of this particular sacral segment 2, 3 and 4. Okay, I am talking about this particular 2, 3, 4 segment of sacral spinal cord. Now this efferent fiber will terminate into this sacral. Of course I am showing this is just for the diagrammatic representation. This fiber is terminating into the sacral spinal cord segment. Now this particular sacral spinal cord segment 2, 3, 4 is known as local sacral micturition center. So it is known as local sacral micturition center. Now from this local spinal cord, local sacral micturition center, the efferent fibers from this lateral gray horn, the efferent parasympathetic fiber will arise, and which will be terminating over the detrusor muscle as well as to the internal urethric sphincter. So I am taking it to the internal urethric sphincter. Now do you guys remember where is the internal urethric sphincter is? Of course it is present at the neck of the bladder. We have seen earlier that at the neck of the bladder we have this internal urethric sphincter. Okay, and at the neck of the bladder we have this internal urethric sphincter, and this parasympathetic efferent is terminating over the neck of the bladder and over the detrusor muscle. So these are the efferent limb. This is the efferent limb, which is which type, sympathetic or parasympathetic? This is the parasympathetic type. Okay, and which now carries this particular parasympathetic fibers? Now yes, it is the same now which will be carrying the efferent fiber, pelvic splanchnic nerve. It is the same nerve. I am not writing the full, I am just write the abbreviation that pelvic splanchnic nerve is the nerve which is having this parasympathetic fiber. So this parasympathetic fiber is now terminating over the detrusor muscle and the internal urethric sphincter. Now first let's focus over this detrusor muscle. So let's say we have this single detrusor muscle. Of course we are having multiple detrusor muscles and multiple these parasympathetic fibers, okay? But this is just for the representation. I am showing one detrusor muscle. Let me erase this stretch receptor. You already know there are multiple stretch receptor, okay? Now it is the parasympathetic outflow which will be get stimulated as the efferent sensation reaches to the sacral segment 2, 3, 4, and from this the stimulation of the parasympathetic fiber will occur. Now stimulation of the parasympathetic fiber will release which kind of neurotransmitter? Here there will be release of yes there will be a release of acetylcholine, okay? Here also at the internal urethric sphincter, the neurotransmitter which will be released here will be the acetylcholine, okay? Now this acetylcholine, the receptor for this particular acetylcholine is present over the detrusor muscle and the smooth muscle. And which type of the receptor here, if I want to be specific, then this particular receptor is muscarinic type 3 receptor. Which type of receptor it is? Let me write here. It is the muscarinic type 3 receptor, which is also called M3 receptor, okay? Okay, so here also at the internal urethric sphincter, we have the muscarinic type 3 receptor. Now release of acetylcholine which will be binding with the muscarinic type 3 receptor, which will cause the excitation of this particular receptor. Now excitation of this muscarinic type 3 receptor over the detrusor muscle, if it get excited, it will cause the contraction of the detrusor muscle. So this particular detrusor muscle will be contracting, and we know that whenever the single detrusor muscle is stimulated, this action potential will spread through the all the detrusor muscle because of this low electrical resistance gap junction, and whole detrusor muscle of the bladder will be contracting. So let's say we are having contraction of the detrusor muscle. At the same point there is release of acetylcholine at the neck of the bladder where our internal urethric sphincter is present. So this particular acetylcholine will stimulate the muscarinic type 3 receptor of internal urethric sphincter, and here we are having the relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter. And now relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter will cause the opening of the internal urethric sphincter. Now here we are having contraction. So here we are having the contraction of the bladder, here we are having the relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter. So whatever the urine which is collected, now this urine will be passed, so there will be a voiding of the urine, okay? So I will erase all this unnecessary, okay? Yes. So this is the micturition reflex. First there will be a collection of the urine which will stimulate our stretch receptor. Now this efferent fiber via this pelvic sphincter now goes to our local sacral micturition center, which is sacral segment 2, 3, 4, and from this it will stimulate the parasympathetic outflow. Now this parasympathetic outflow is the efferent one. It is also present in this pelvic sphincter. Now some fiber will terminate over the detrusor muscle, some fiber terminate over the internal urethric sphincter. Both the fibers or all the fiber of the parasympathetic one which release the acetylcholine. Now this acetylcholine will work on this particular detrusor muscle and the internal urethric sphincter via this receptor. Both the side receptor present over is the muscarinic type 3 receptor. Stimulation of the detrusor muscle will cause the contraction, and there will be a, since is a contraction of whole bladder, we can say contraction is a syncytium or single unit contraction. Simultaneously there is a relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter. Ultimate effect will be the voiding of this collected urine, okay? So what is the reflex in physiology or in medicine? whenever the reflex word come, like micturition reflex, accommodation reflex, light reflex. Reflex means we are having some let me change the color. We are having some sensory stimulation, and this sensory stimulation will provoke some kind of motor response. You can see in our bladder, the sensory response will be the stretching of a stretch receptor, which will be stimulation of the stretch receptor is the sensory input. This sensory input provoke this motor response via activation of this parasympathetic fiber, and contraction of the bladder and relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter is what we call the motor response. So sensory stimulation provokes some kind of motor response, but we can see that this efferent which carried to only the local sacral micturition center or only local sacral segment 2, 3, 4. There is no any involvement of our higher center or higher brain. Okay, so there is no involvement of higher center, higher, I can say, cortical centers, only involvement of local reflex center. In our case there is sacral micturition, local sacral micturition center. ठीक है, तो ये है रिफ्लेक्स. रिफ्लेक्स का मतलब क्या है ये हमने समझ लिया ना. रिफ्लेक्स आर्क, उसका मतलब सिंपल है, आपको पता ही है, सिर्फ हमें रिवाइज करना है. रिफ्लेक्स आर्क का मतलब है हम अलग अलग कंपोनेंट को डिस्कस करेंगे. जैसे कि सबसे पहले मैं बात करूँगा व्हाट आर दी रिसेप्टर. कोई भी रिफ्लेक्स है, कोई भी उसमें रिफ्लेक्स आर्क होती है, तो हम ये चीज़ों के ऊपर डिस्कस करते हैं आपको कि उसके रिसेप्टर्स क्या है. ठीक है, उसके बाद उसका एफरेंट लिम्ब कौन सा है, कौन सी नर्व है जो एफरेंट के लिए एफरेंट के हिसाब से काम करती है ना. उसके बाद है कि उसका जो लोकल सेंटर है वो कौन सा है. ठीक है, इसके बाद हम बात करते हैं कि इफरेंट लिम्ब कौन सा है. ठीक है, देन उसके बाद हम बात करेंगे कि इफेक्टर ऑर्गन या फिर इफेक्टर मसल कौन सा है. ठीक है, एंड अल्टीमेटली क्या इफेक्ट आती है, द फाइनल इफेक्ट कौन सी है. इन चीज़ों के ऊपर जब हम बात करेंगे तो हमने रिफ्लेक्स आर्क की कंप्लीट बात की. तो हमारे केस में रिफ्लेक्स आर्क में हम क्या बात करेंगे, रिसेप्टर कौन सा है आप मुझे बताइए. यस, रिसेप्टर कौन सा है. यस, वी हैव दिस स्ट्रेच रिसेप्टर्स. ओके, एफरेंट लिम्ब, ये हमारा एफरेंट लिम्ब है. ये कौन सी नर्व में है. यस, इट इज़ इन पेल्विक स्प्लिंक्निक नर्व. ओके, लोकल सेंटर कहाँ पे था, लोकल सेंटर कौन सा है. यस, लोकल सेंटर इज sacral segment 2, 3 and 4, also known as local micturition, sacral micturition center. Efferent limb कौन सा था. efferent limb, yes, efferent limb is sympathetic or parasympathetic. efferent limb is parasympathetic now, parasympathetic type, and which is present in the, yes, pelvic splanchnic nerve. Same. Okay, इफेक्टर ऑर्गन और वी कैन से इफेक्टर मसल. ये इफरेंट था, वो कहाँ पे एंड हो रहा था, कहाँ पे वो इफेक्ट कर रहा था. तो एक तो था डेट्रूजर मसल. ठीक है, डीएम का मतलब डेट्रूजर मसल. ठीक है, और डायबिटीज मेलाइटिस नहीं है, डीएम का मतलब है डेट्रूजर मसल. स्पेस नहीं है मेरे पास, इसीलिए मैं शॉर्ट फॉर्म लिख रहा हूँ. और एक और चीज़ थी, इंटरनल यूरेथ्रिक स्फिंक्टर पे एंड हो रहा था. ठीक है, फाइनल इफेक्ट क्या था. अगर हम डेट्रूजर मसल्स की बात करें तो यहाँ पे एक रिसेप्टर कौन सा था, न्यूरोट्रांसमीटर क्या रिलीज़ हो रहा था, एसिटाइलकोलिन. ठीक है, और रिसेप्टर कौन सा था, मस्केरिनिक टाइप 3. और अल्टीमेट इफेक्ट क्या थी, इट विल बी अ कॉन्ट्रैक्शन ऑफ द डेट्रूजर मसल. ठीक है, एट द इंटरनल यूरेथ्रिक स्फिंक्टर न्यूरोट्रांसमीटर कौन सा रिलीज होता था, एसिटाइलकोलिन. सेम, रिसेप्टर भी कौन सा था, मस्केरिनिक टाइप 3 रिसेप्टर, एंड इफेक्ट विल बी अ relaxation of the internal urethric sphincter. So this is our micturition reflex arc. So it is known as micturition reflex arc. इसके बहुत से कंपोनेंट हैं, अलग अलग कंपोनेंट है, ठीक है. और रिफ्लेक्स का मतलब क्या है ये हमने जान लिया. रिफ्लेक्स, व्हाट इज द micturition reflex मीनिंग, और एनी काइंड ऑफ रिफ्लेक्स वी कैन से, ठीक है. ओके.